Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on we hope will be a interesting panel discussion where we're tackling two major questions about CRISPR. How do you engineer it? What is the sort of horizon of engineering, and the challenges when it comes to explaining what this technology is, and in both educational, both formal and informal educational settings. I am the executive producer and a producer on the Human Nature documentary, which featured Synthego among all the panelists here as well. We're very excited about this. It's now available to watch on Netflix, and we're going to talk a lot about how that film was made and sort of why we made it, and sort of the challenges and sort of excitement that came about making it. But first, we're going to introduce the panelists and actually have them introduce themselves. And first up is Fyodor. Could you go first, jump in?
Sure. Hi, folks. I'm Fyodor Urnov. I'm a professor in the molecular and cell biology department here at UC Berkeley, and I direct technology and translation at the Innovative Genomics Institute here at Berkeley as well.
Thank you. And Alta?
Hello, I'm Alta Charo. I'm a professor of law and bioethics at the University of Wisconsin. I co-chaired the National Academy of Sciences report on genome editing, regulation, and ethics.
Great. Tashaka?
I'm Tashaka Cunningham. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of True Genomic, Inc., and the Executive Director of the faith-based Genetic Research Institute that does community outreach around genomics, gene editing, and health for diverse communities.
Thank you. And those of you who have seen Human Nature will have noticed that we'll have seen Fyodor and Alta and Tashaka in the film. What you've not have seen, but who played a very big role behind the scenes of the film, and is in the credits, obviously, is Sarah. Sarah Goodwin, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, I'm Sarah Goodwin. I'm the executive director of the Wonder Collaborative, which is the organization that produced the film, and I was a producer and the lead scientific advisor on the film. Great.
Well, let's jump right in. I mean, the question is, like, this is a cutting edge technology, and that means that horizons change with almost by the day. Fyodor, sort of, as best you can, give us a lay of the landscape. Where are we with this? How fast are things changing? And where do you think, how do you sort of see the topography right in the moment and in the near future?
Sure, happy to cover this little topic in about 2 minutes. Okay, so here's what I can offer. So 8 years ago here at Berkeley, Jennifer's lab in collaboration with Emmanuel discovered the remarkable fact that this molecule, Cas9, can be guided by an RNA to drive a double-strand break in a molecule of interest. And 7 years later, CRISPR Therapeutics, an aptly named biotech, reported that a subject on their clinical trial for sickle cell disease, a woman whose name is Victoria Gray, and we know her name because she bravely allowed National Public Radio to report about her, has, as best as we can tell, been cured of her sickle cell disease via CRISPR-Cas-driven genome editing of her hematopoietic stem cells. And, we live in an age of technology innovation. We'll now have the iPhone 13. We'll have self-driving cars, what have you. But I think we have to take a deep, joyful breath over the fact that in our lifetime, one of the most prevalent monogenic diseases on Earth, and sickle is very widespread, as well as its sister disease, beta thalassemia. We've known the genetic basis. We've known its genetics since the 1920s. We've known its monogenic since the 40s. We've known the molecular cause since the 1950s. We've really not had a lot to help folks with sickle, especially those who are out of the pediatric healthcare system, the adult individuals. So here we are. We have reached, as a species, a staggering milestone. We have taken a human being and rewritten her genetic code in a way that has apparently rid her of a hugely life-threatening disease. Now what? Oh my goodness. So I suppose we have to get and Alta can speak to this a lot better than I can because she thinks about this professionally and much more deeply. So here's the thing that I'm not going to say anything about because I've frankly had it up to here, which is embryo editing, which is not interesting, enormously time-consuming, and hugely distracting from the potential of CRISPR to impact the planet in so many positive ways, which is ag, healthcare, understanding of biology, and beyond. And, in the second, I think that now that the field has been so empowered with a CRISPR cure and speaking to biomedicine, and standing on the shoulders of a 30-year precedent in cell and gene therapy more broadly, where we've had, gene therapy cures for blindness. We have children who can finally see. We have gene therapy cures for cancer. We have children who would have been dead, and they have been prescribed and approved medicine in the gene therapy space, and they're now alive. So I think that our field is focused largely on one thing: how do we make the adoption curve and the impact curve of CRISPR-Cas, this Nobel Prize-winning discovery, over the next decade, to not look like this, but to look like this. And I see the sort of the big picture directions in that regard as being threefold. And believe it or not, the technology development, let's make Cas99. We already have Cas9. Let's make Cas99. I mean, yes, a lot of that's happening, and that's amazing. But I think, speaking for an area of my technical expertise, passion, and current work, is I think we as a community of editors, clinically minded, are really focused on broadening the impact. We have an early success in sickle and in thal. We have clinical trials in blindness. We are about to have, and cancer, we're about to have a clinical trial, we hope, in cardiovascular disease, in liver disease, and this is Intellia's work, and Verve Therapeutics in inverse order. The earlier blindness is Editas Medicine. And we're about to have a bunch of academic trials. Matt Porteous at Stanford is doing a trial for sickle, and so on and so on. What will it take to have the next 5 years quintuple or increase the number of these by a log? When will we have the first approved medicine? And honestly, the issues that underlie that are to some extent technological, but many of them have to do with funding for science, the economics of healthcare. So I don't want to finger point in other directions, but frankly, they have sort of expanded beyond the narrow reach of CRISPR technology. The other two things I'll say, and then I'm very eager for my esteemed colleagues' perspective. I am very eager to see CRISPR-Cas advance from genetic disease with simple causes to complex diseases with more elaborate causes, neurodegeneration, autoimmunity, everything from inflammatory bowel disease to diabetes. Disorders of the pulmonary system, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, all of these sort of scary acronyms, NASH, COPD, that if you have one of those attached to your life, you are not a happy camper. And the reason I bring this up is we have never had the ability to engage with the genome in a targeted fashion the way we have with this. It is fundamentally, last thing I'll say, routable to multiple destinations. How to make that happen is a major area of CRISPR focus. Elliot, I'm going to pause because, again, as you can imagine, I'm excited. I could rant about this for a while.
No, I mean, and few people can describe it with such sort of fluency and excitement. And I mean, I think that it's important to remember how exciting this is and how recent. I mean, we're still in the afterglow of the excitement. I mean, usually Nobel Prizes are given decades after it. This has all been condensed. And maybe to shock, I mean, one thing I want to pick up on that Fyodor is talking about is that because it's so condensed, because it's such a powerful central tool, it really can reach very quickly into into many different diseases. But it touches on questions of access. It touches on questions of healthcare, of funding, of as well as the challenges of just using an emergent technology. You really sort of sit in a sort of the intersection of so many of the different factors that are at play here, on the business side, the academic side, the basic research side, the access side. How do you sort of explain to people, in the different communities in which you're talking, sort of the power but also sort of the limits around this technology in its current form?
In a short phrase, very carefully, I share Fyodor's enthusiasm as a scientist for this technology, and I am too amazed at how rapidly everything has progressed from a basic research kind of discovery to an actual clinical application. I think the speed and magnitude with which CRISPR has moved is truly exciting and impressive. I'm also, again, having spent time in pharma and, interfaced with regulators, as I'm doing now with my current company, understanding the need to fully understand how it's all working. And I think what I'd love to see from this field, CRISPR as it emerges, is just a deepening of our resolution on how it all works. What are all of the pros and cons of this? I know the pros, just as Fyodor's laid out. We want to really make sure we understand all the cons from a clinical perspective. And I think that's going to come out in these trials. And I'm very excited by that. How I communicate this to audiences is starting out very basic. There's this point that we can actually do this, that we are at this juncture in time that we can change and interface with our genome, as Fyodor said, in ways that we never could before. And what does that mean for us? I think there's some ground we all have to cover just in the world, even understanding basic genetics. What's the meaning of genetics and testing? So I understand what I want to change, right? So in order to understand what you have to change, you have to understand the what. So I think that's a piece that we spend a lot of time on, just educating folks who might not even really know what DNA is and why it's important to them. So if we're starting from the place where we don't know really what it is or how it functions or how it's important to us, how am I going to understand how you can change it in me now, right? So I think that these are dialogues that we have to have across spectrums, across education levels, across racial, ethnic boundaries, because different communities, which has been my experience, are going to interpret and view this differently. Just because we should do this, one community may feel like we shouldn't because it's playing God or it's getting into a space that we don't want to get into. So I don't want to take the dialogue there too early, but some of the community interactions I've had, that's a lot of the feedback we've gotten, And I'll use a specific example. I spend a lot of time speaking in churches, particularly predominantly African-American churches. And years ago, before we had these breakthroughs that Fyodor was talking about, but the technology was still new, when I was explaining to communities that this technology is on the horizon and there, the first response I got was, so wait a minute, are they going to make everyone have blonde hair and blue eyes? So my African-American colleagues, that was the first fear that they had. So first of all, saying, no, they're not going to do that. Human cloning is against the law. But B, there was first fear. And I think there's a lot of really psychological issues wrapped up in that, depending on the community's experience with the medical establishment. So these are all kinds of things that we should discuss as this new technology makes it out there.
I mean, Alta, one of the things that we tried to do in our film was, and there's only so much you could cover, but that to show that you can't isolate these conversations from each other, that the basic science, the regulation, the fears and the hopes, the history that exists around eugenics, around genetic screening, around complicated questions of equity, and we're seeing right now, obviously, that we're in a really fraught moment around public confidence in science, and that a lot of the limits, there are real limits, technical limits. I want to dive in a little, further with Fyodor and Shaka as well about, off-target use and what can we expect some of these things to come online. But a lot of that timeline is also going to be predicated on questions around society and regulation and communication. How do you sort of see the current state? I mean, and you've been sort of looking at how we talk about science and its impact and for a long time, and seen other, GMOs and other vaccines and other, which are back obviously of great concern today. How do you sort of see that level, hearing everything that Shaka and Fyodor are talking about what it can accomplish, but understanding that it has to live in a broader society, that these breakthroughs live in a broader society?
Yeah, it's a challenge when you're talking about something that's a tool. Genome editing is a tool, and you can put it to any number of uses. Some of them are quite laudable, and others are really quite scary. And so the question becomes, what do? Do you ban the tool? Do you permit some things and absolutely ban others? Or do you try to regulate and be very careful and incremental about how things are introduced? And complicating that as well is just some of the politics around some of these things. I mean, Fyodor and Chaka have both introduced the issue of access, and that's a tough one because as currently done, these technologies will be terribly expensive on a per person basis. And economics and business is hard. We've not found a good solution in healthcare and healthcare products yet. So it's really, in many ways, much more intriguing for the general public to talk about the other kinds of concerns, which may be more futuristic, but are still the easier ones to talk about. So there's agriculture, the ability to use this not for humans, but to edit plants and animals, to manage to adapt to climate change, to increase environmental protection by making them leave a lesser footprint on the land. But it gets very much caught up in the politics around, as you put it, GMOs, and some of the suspicion not only of scientists, but of big agricultural business and multinational business. There's on the horizon is the possibility of tackling some diseases as early as the fetal stage with in utero editing. Wouldn't change the next generation. It's not heritable, but it would allow for some kind of intervention before a child already has sustained damage from a genetic problem. But it gets us right into the middle of the abortion debate. There are concerns even with the somatic, purely non-heritable editing for adults or already born children about whether or not it'll be used to enhance people in a way that gives them some kind of competitive edge. And yet we have a very uncomfortable conversation around a lot of enhancements we already use, whether it's the plastic surgery that somebody does, or it's the enhanced nutritional or hormonal treatments that some athletes will take. And we haven't really come to a clear idea in our minds about what we want our competitions to be measuring. Your capacity at birth, your capacity at birth plus training, or your capacity at birth plus training, but whatever else you can use, like your Speedo bathing suits, to give yourself an edge. And then last but not least is what Fyodor is just so, as you put it, fed up with, which is the so-called designer baby issue. To edit at the level of the sperm or the egg or the embryo to make a change, not only to have a child born without the problem, but also to have a change that goes down through generations. And, the National Academy of Sciences Committee was, I think, the first really big national level committee statement to come out and say that this kind of heritable editing doesn't have to be absolutely banned. And it said that because there were a few defensible situations where you might use it, and where there were natural limitations to how often people would want to use it, which would keep it very, very rare. For one thing, you need to do IVF. For another, there is the fear of adverse events, so you're not going to do it for trivial reasons. But more deeply, and I'll end with this, was really a kind of discussion around a more fundamental principle, and that is whether we should always be preferencing the freedom to do science and to explore therapies under a regulatory system that will hold us back at the point at which there's a real risk of harm, or if we should cut things off completely with a kind of outright ban and say that they're just wrong, even if we can imagine a few places where you could defend them. That's a more kind of philosophical discussion around civil society and the relationship of science to society.
I think that's a nice segue to, Sarah, I want to talk to you about this idea of the relationship between science and society, and your own background, getting a Ph.D. in sort of basic science, and then have migrated and taken that foundation to really sort of become an innovator in science communication on many different levels. But this film is its own level of communication. And how important do you think it is for scientists, people training in science, and people on this call, who are in the film, to take on the role of educating and informing the general public in both informal and informal educational settings? And sort of how did that sort of mission guide the making of this film from your point of view?
Yeah, so in the film Human Nature, one of our big goals was really to communicate how CRISPR works and how it was discovered, and really kind of give a voice to the scientists that played a role in turning CRISPR, kind of understanding how it works and then turning it into a technology. And we felt like it was really important for the scientists to be able to speak for themselves, to talk about why they were excited about what they were doing, and to really kind of give a face to the science. I think that a lot of times when CRISPR is talked about in the general public, maybe there's one scientist associated with it, or they kind of leap to some of the things that have been already discussed on this call, like designer babies, or maybe you're just even talking about the treatments, but you don't really get the full picture of all the thought and effort that went into this discovery and its applications. And so I guess the goal with the film was we really wanted to create something where we laid out the science as clearly as possible, so people could as many people as possible could understand it. We wanted to show how science is done, where it's built on top of one another. So discoveries are kind of built on one another. And then we really wanted to lay out kind of all of the issues that come out of it. And so I guess back to your question, I think it is very important for scientists to be able to engage with the public about the work they're doing on. But I also think there's a role for people who understand how science works to work with the scientists to communicate those messages. I think that can be a really effective way to engage with the public. It doesn't have to be that every scientist working on something has to take it on themselves to really engage in dialogue, but at least to be open to working with people who can help get their message out there as to what they're working on, what the societal implications are. I guess what's been exciting about Human Nature, especially now with its release more broadly, coinciding with the Nobel Prize, is just how many people will hear about the Nobel Prize and then can watch a film to really understand what the science is and how it came about, told by some of the Nobel Prize winners themselves, but also engaging with other people who have thought very deeply about CRISPR and also worked on CRISPR. So I guess that's kind of a roundabout way to try to address some of the things that you brought up. But, we're really at a critical time, especially in this country, where we need to, really establish or reestablish or continue to establish the trust in science and scientists. And so I think having things like Human Nature or other ways where, scientists are really engaging with the public and, in ways where it really highlights their all their efforts, their thoughts on things, their credibility is just so important right now.
You mentioned the process of science, and it's something we try to highlight. And I think Fyodor does a wonderful job in the film of talking about sort of putting on your Sherlock Holmes hat and your virtual pipe and sort of looking for things. I think at the same time, we're living in a point where people are really sort of seeing science unfold in real time and not be prepared for it. When are we going to get a vaccine? Why aren't we getting therapeutics? Why are the directives changing as more data comes in? A lot of this time, this sort of messiness or excitement or process or journey of science is hidden from the public. There's a Nobel Prize given way after it's been developed. Something's been developed, and sort of whatever seeps in. And I guess, Fyodor, you talked about the horizon here and some of the challenges and hopes around engineering with this, but how do you answer that question for people? Like, when is this coming? What is the time frame? How do you caution people or give a sense of a technology that's so new, so powerful, has had such an impact so quickly? Are people's hopes are they coming up too soon for cures? Are they not prepared for what's coming? How do you balance this sort of this science taking place at such a powerful level in real time with people keyed in, and where really people's literally life and death decisions could hang on when these therapeutic or when these treatments or other things could become available?
I'll just tell you what is currently haunting me in that regard. I got an email over the weekend from a person, and they wrote to me about the film, and they said, listen, I wonder that you spoke with caution about modifying personality. And they continued, I was the victim of a sexual assault as a child, and it has hurt my entire life, the trauma.
I got the same letter.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't get it out of my head because this person continues to say, if you could, use CRISPR to remove the propensity for sexual violence from humanity, why wouldn't you? And I will admit, Alta, I'm really eager for your perspective. I just froze, not out of an inability of having anything to say. I have a lot to say, but more or less out of a sense of responsibility. Like it came, like Jennifer gets hundreds of emails a month. I get dozens, mostly from parents of children with genetic diseases. And they're breathtakingly heartbreaking, especially when you know that, we have in our hands, not as a plastic model, but as a real world actionable reagent, the tool, and this is CRISPR-Cas, by the way, the tool to repair these mutations. And it turns out that in a number of the cases of the parents writing to us, we actually have something specific to communicate. For example, we work a lot on rare diseases of the immune system. We work on the hemoglobinopathies. We have a lot of interest in neurodegeneration and cancer. But Elliot, I would just want to highlight the extent to which all of us in the editing community think of the responsibility and are mindful of the responsibility. And frankly, the hope, I know this is a tremendously lofty thing to say, like humanity's hopes. We're carrying this remarkable discovery in our hands to the real world. And so none of us get a lot of sleep, that's fair to say. And the only thing I'll say to sort of when will this be? Well, so first of all, it's here now. There are multiple clinical trials, first in human, for disorders as distinct as cancer and blindness, hemophilia and immune deficiency, sickle cell disease, and soon to start muscular dystrophy. In brass tacks terms, a given clinical trial of this type from start to finish takes anywhere between 5 and 6 years, the whole thing, until the people who put this together can go to the FDA or Health Canada or the EMA or the Therapeutics Goods Administration in Australia or any of the other regulators and say, okay, please approve us so that a physician can prescribe it. So when is the next batch of CRISPR medicines going to be potentially approved? About 5 to 6 years from now. And the range will be broad. But I think the real sort of the challenge we're all mindful of, and this touches very closely on the issue of equity, is how to ethically, sustainably, and affordably broaden the scope of applications as much as it deserves to. Jonathan, I'm super curious for your perspective.
Yeah. I have a really interesting take on that. Again, as someone who's working in a field, mental and behavioral health with PTSD, it's polygenic. It's something we're still at the level that we're trying to understand the genetics of this disease, right? And as we get there with all these other diseases, I think the potential for CRISPR is fascinating to me. I'm hopeful that we'll have an even more refined set of CRISPR tools 10 years from now, 5 years from now, as we better understand some of these complex polygenic disorders, that is, disorders that require more than one gene to actually see the phenotype. I think we'll get there. I'm a believer in it. I believe we're with CRISPR where we were at the early days of the space program, right? We've done an initial launch. We've gotten up that first rocket, and now we got to become the space shuttle and the space station, right? And so I think that's how this technology reminds me of that, and it fills me with that level of inspiration. I'm hopeful to see it all happen. But when you talk about that access and equity thing, this is going to be really important, because right now, I'll just point out, of the scientists in the country that do CRISPR, how many of them are African American? How many of them are people of color even, right? So we cannot have this as this immense technology, just the realm of certain people in certain elite circles. So this is something that I'm going to be pushing for, just more global education on this, starting early, even kids being educated on this. And it starts with things like this film. I think this film is a great sort of basic introduction to the entirety of this field, but there's still a lot of hard work on our side to do to make sure that everyone has equal access, equal understanding, and equal ability to participate in this revolution that this new technology and this new tool is going to bring about.
Elliot, if I may add something very briefly to that. Often with new inventions, we find that the first versions are very expensive and only a few people can get it. And we rely on the market over time to expand the consumer base to the point where things become standardized and routinized and price drops. Sometimes dramatically, like in computing, sometimes less dramatically, but even so in things like automobiles. But, you know, we could do it differently. When it came to the antiretrovirals for HIV, having discovered that there was a very long and expensive kind of regime with multiple drugs that would work to help mothers not pass on the virus to their children if they were pregnant while infected, there was a concerted effort to figure out how we could make this more easily delivered logistically and financially. And money was put into clinical trials to look at more abbreviated studies, different drug combinations that were easier to get generically. And we found ways to make this more available for more parts of the world. We have the opportunity, if we want to try to do the same thing here, to direct some of our research funding and energy specifically toward trying to translate some of the things that are being done now and try to imagine another way to do them or to deliver them so that they are more easily done, let's say, in the poorer parts of the Caribbean or of Africa or of Asia, or the poorer parts of the United States, frankly. But that's a political decision we have to make, to put our money there and make that a priority.
I'd like to follow up on that, Alta, and sort of broaden this discussion of equity and access and everything. I mean, we talked about, yes, human applications and medical applications are one thing. You know, I mean, there's a growing feeling, especially living out where I do in California, that we've sort of crossed a boundary of, you know, into some hellish landscape of the future when it comes to climate change. You know, can genetic engineering around carbon questions, around agriculture, you know, around resilience? I mean, this is something I see even in the comment section is popping up a lot. You know, so that's a whole other, you know, part that's often not discussed enough, and I know that's something you've thought about, sort of. And oftentimes we're limited by our own, you know, experience that we around what we can imagine. But that also brings up its own equity questions. Who's deciding whose part of the world gets re-engineered, and, you know, what's best use of land use, and who's in the decision making, especially in countries where there's a ruling elite. And, you know, I mean, these are also complicated questions. Yeah. You know, as opposed to, in addition to who's going to be able afford to get a treatment for a specific disease, right?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, agriculture is the perfect example. We can look to a future where you could engineer animals so that they excrete less phosphorus, and so there's less problems with runoff into lakes. You then have fewer animals, more animals raised on the same amount of land, or do you accept the benefit of the cleaner rivers? That's going to be a contest between the people who have an investment in that business and the people who have an investment in conservation and politics. What kinds of crops we worry about, what kinds of inventions we work on is certainly going to be influenced by who's most able to say, that's where I want to put my money, that's where I want to put out a request for proposals from people who might be able to develop that for me. We do have some world institutions, though, that can help. So we have through the United Nations, we have institutions that could use funds to try and worry about what's most needed in the poorest and most vulnerable areas of the world.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm going to turn to you and I want to go, you know, from this sort of global sense to, I mean, ultimately, these are really also touch on some very personal issues. I mean, through the making of this film and then now in its release, you had 2 children, and, you know, and I just am curious, sort of, when you have immersed yourself in this discussion and knowledge, you know, how does it sort of shape your own personal views? I mean, you know, another one of the producers, Meredith, also had a child through the making of this film, and, you know, it was really interesting to sort of, while we're dealing with this global scale, to remember that ultimately a lot of its impact is going to boil down to individual decisions, individual questions and concerns. How did that framing, did it change at all while you were making it? Did it shape? Did you find yourself thinking a lot about this as you went through these process?
Yeah, and you know, I don't really have a good or well thought out answer to that, because it is, you know, going through the process of having a child while being immersed in discussing, CRISPR with scientists and just kind of all the ethical and societal implications that came out of it. It really just made me think about what I would do in different situations. And, I feel really fortunate that, I was able to do genetic testing before so I'm Jewish and my husband's Jewish. So we did some genetic testing because there's some genetic diseases, that we were maybe more at risk to passing down to our children. And had access to that, and there wasn't anything that came up, but what would I have done if there was, and, CRISPR wouldn't have been available to me now, but if I were, 10 or 20 years in the future, or, other people on this call can probably comment on when that type of thing might be available to individuals, what would I have done? I mean, already you can, if I were going through IVF, there were things that I could do to kind of screen for certain things, but that wasn't something that I was planning to go through. So, and it really hit home that, people really are going to end up making the decisions that work best for their situation and their families. And it really does come down to an individual's decision and what they know about genetics, what finances they have, what access to medical care they have. I mean, there's so many different layers to it. But it really made me feel more for the people who are really facing these difficult questions with, really terrible, looking at, potentially having children with really, terrible genetic diseases that could potentially be, fixed or cured by gene editing. In terms of the designer baby, which has been brought up, I think it also kind of hit home to me, like how far away that really does feel. I mean, it is what is brought up a lot in the popular media, but I just, I'm coming from my own personal feeling about it, but in just having 2 kids and just getting to see the wonder and excitement of just, them discovering different things and their own people and learning, who they are, just making any deliberate decisions about what I would expect from them. Like, are they going to, like, even though we don't know what intelligence is, like, let's say there was something where you could, there's some people who think you could select for intelligence. I don't agree with that, but let's say that was available to someone. Like, would I really do that? Especially if I don't know what, what some of the unknowns could be if you start making decisions about changing the genetic code. So I guess it made me think a lot deeper about a lot of these questions that are coming up, especially when people are bringing up CRISPR in different contexts. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. And I do think that, though, that frankly access, especially to some of these treatments that Fyodor discussed in the very first question that are going to come out, is really just one of the biggest issues too, especially when you're talking about, parents who might want to look at fixing the, chance for their children to have some genetic diseases that can be really terrible.
Fyodor, one thing I want to sort of play off that, and we have another about 10 minutes left in this, or a little less. But this question of making a decision also comes with a question of knowledge. And one thing that I was struck very positively by is the number of the scientists that really participated in this discovery, how generous they were with their time around making this film. I know, Jennifer Doudna takes, in addition to doing world-class research, takes communication very, very seriously, as do you and others. I mean, how important, there has traditionally been a sort of a breach a bit between, scientists who communicate and scientists who do research. And, do you think CRISPR is shifting that dynamic? Do you think that there's a generational shift? Do you think that we can get to a point where communication becomes really valued as part of the scientific enterprise? Or do you think that that's a mischaracterization of the past?
Well, as an experimental scientist, I'm driven by data. And I can tell you what happened 2 weeks ago, before Jennifer and Emmanuel won the Nobel Prize, is I stepped out of the IGI building on the Berkeley campus, and wearing my CRISPR t-shirt, I go to a local coffee shop, just hole in the wall, to get some espresso. And the barista looks at my shirt and goes, "Whoa, you do that gene editing thing?" I go, "Why, yes, I do. In fact, let me tell you this. I work with Jennifer Doudna." And the barista goes, "The latte is on the house." So I texted Jennifer and I said, "Hey, thanks." Yes, I think in CRISPR-Cas and genome editing, and I'm reading all the questions, the range of different folks and the kinds of perspectives they bring, we have an extraordinary moment in the history of the interface between science and society. Because, yes, on the Berkeley campus, there's the beautiful ivory tower, the Campanile, which is a copy of the one in Venice. And it's almost like the stereotype. There are the academics stuck in their silos pursuing problems that they can't even state in English. No, I mean, look at the questions in the chat. Well, what about engineering for global warming? What about equitable access? How do you control editing in polyploid crops? What about the other diseases? So I really salute Jennifer personally, frankly, for having taken such a clear citizen scientist role. I'm frankly inspired by her, and I know many people are. And it's not enough, I think, to have, legions of high school students from now until eternity memorizing that CRISPR stands for, clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats, which is frankly not the acronym they should be memorizing. But to use this as an opportunity to connect a generation, many generations to come, fundamental advances into real world impact. And most people know that Einstein's theory of relativity has impacted the real world in the invention of GPS. So for GPS to work, you have to make the Einstein adjustment because of the way special relativity works. But I mean, you turn to a random person on the street and say, how has science impacted you? And I think with CRISPR and gene editing, from crops to animals or ag to CRISPR cures and understanding disease, we have just an extraordinary opportunity like we've never had to highlight the key impact that basic research has on life, right? I mean, Jennifer and Emmanuel were driven by curiosity. And Jennifer and Jill Banfield in the movie speak quite eloquently to this, as do the other scientists, Mojica and Rodolfo Barango and everyone. So to speak about the fact that such basic research can rapidly make an impact, and that this dialogue, and I really want to echo what Chaka said about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, which are very dear to our heart at the IGI and at UC Berkeley being a public university, making sure that the diverse stakeholders are at the table, as opposed to, here's a scientific advance, enjoy. That is not what we should be doing. And perhaps last, but perhaps first, I really hope that what's been happening over the past 7 or 8 years, and frankly, Sarah, Elliot, thank you for making the film the way you did, will inspire more scientists, normally surrounded by the walls of their lab and the equations and the formulas, to have more of a citizen scientist role. Again, I think, Elliot and Sarah, you did such a great job, and I often say, I have never seen scientists represented in a more true light as they're fired up about discovery. Jennifer, Jill, Rodolphe, Matt Porteous, Fang, and I'm missing Mojica, a whole bunch of scientists geeking out on what they do. Yeah. And it reminded me in the best of ways of the only other film I know has ever tried this is Particle Fever. It's a movie where we get to watch a bunch of particle physicists debate the Higgs boson. It's amazing. So I really hope that this kind of filmmaking, this kind of science communication that you are doing will inspire more scientists to become citizen scientists.
It's great. I appreciate it. And Shaka, I mean, I would just finally, I want to turn to you for the last comment on this. I mean, and jump in to say what you want to say, but I'm just wondering, do you find that people that you're talking to, that this eagerness for communication is there too, and that the sort of sense that, is there hope that we can bridge this divide between science and the public, and that we can do that in ways that reaches all segments of society?
Absolutely. And I think it's important. I mean, look, even those of us who are early in our careers, I'm sort of mid-career, so I'm not at that Nobel laureate level, maybe never, who knows, right? But as a scientist, you have an obligation to share your knowledge. And this has never been more important to me than the recent pandemic that we're in. I have a PhD in virology, so I've now become de facto the virology expert for an entire African American community here in the DC area. I'm the guy they come to ask about COVID. And it's been great because it gives me a chance to share the knowledge I have and try to keep people safe. It's important. And whether it's something like COVID and understanding what a coronavirus is and why you should wear a mask, versus even CRISPR and understanding what gene editing is and why you need to understand it, how it can change your health, it is important to have a diverse set of communicators. One of the things I was most just sort of excited about to see Dr. Dowden and Dr. Champertier win the Nobel Prize is that they were women. And I think what that means for future generations, for female scientists, is going to be huge. And so I'm also waiting for the days that we see more diversity on the Nobel side, being African-American, Hispanic, and others, Latino Americans, that we see this diversity of people that are receiving these highest honors. That's going to open up the scientific dialogue. But it's incumbent upon all of us who are scientists, no matter what station or racial ethnic background we're from, to be a part of the dialogue. We can no longer afford to be in silos, behind closed doors like we'd like to be. We have to share our knowledge with the world, because these new technologies are changing our world, and it's incumbent upon us to be the arbiters, the honest brokers of that information.
Well, I mean, I think we could, talk for hours about this. I hope people watch the film Human Nature. It's on Netflix. You'll hear from everybody on this, and a lot to say. And the goal here is really making this film is to start a conversation, to hear more. There's only so much we could put into this film. The field develops, the science develops, the ethics develops, and it really is incumbent on all of us to take part and to learn, and not just to sit back, but to engage and share our thoughts and voices, both in the public sphere and with our friends and family and in education. So I want to thank everybody. Thank Synthego for organizing this. And I think, Kevin, it's turning it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Elliot. Actually, I was wondering, maybe would you all be okay just to do some Q&A from the audience? We've had quite a few questions come through on the side. Yeah. Elliot, if you want, you could lean over to the right side there. You can see it says Q&A, and you can read some of those questions yourself, or I can pitch them to you. But I think you should be able to do it yourself if you like.
So Horace Walcott asks a fantastic question I'd love to touch on. May I?
Okay, yes.
Horace Walcott, we've done quite well interfacing with the human genome. I agree with you. What is the pathway bridging the genome with the gene or consciousness? That is the question with an uppercase Q. It's all atoms, right? At least that's the reductionist perspective. And atoms don't emerge out of nowhere. And the way they're put together in our bodies is driven by, the 6.6 times 10 to the 9th base pairs of our DNA. We have a way to engage with it. How are we going to use that to engage with who we are? I have no idea. And I'm not trying to be sort of, classic academic scientist hand-wringing and, epistemic paralysis. We've never had that ability. And again, I want to touch back to this person who bravely wrote to me and to Alta, I guess, saying, look, don't talk to me about being concerned about applying this to human nature. How about you CRISPR out violence? Our generation's responsibility as we advance CRISPR for treating existing disease, and as it becomes safer and more effective, is to ask, what will it do for us 50 years from now? Is it going to be like Botox, a niche thing that people inject in their faces or whatever to get rid of wrinkles? Or will this be a fundamental agent for the good in approaching who we are as who we are? I don't have the education in it, frankly, to speak to this, but I just want to thank Horace Walcott for touching on something that we don't talk enough about, which is we can change DNA, we can change human nature. Should we? I think this is, unless we keep asking that question and talking about it and understanding how that aligns with what we can do and what the needs are, I think we will do a disservice to the technology.
Fyodor, in my own community, which crosses between law and bioethics, there's already been some debate around so-called moral enhancement. Mm-hmm. If you could find a physiological phenomenon that explains the kind of way in which your body reacts to things that, let's say, are different, and it creates a stress hormone that makes you feel uncomfortable. If that were somehow related, let's say, to the way in which we now have problems of racism or violence between people who look or sound different, should we think about finding pharmaceutical interventions, including editing, that would get rid of that? It's a really interesting debate. It's obvious that, first of all, going back to the early thing, we need more people in law and social science to actually know some natural science so that these discussions are grounded in reality. So it's a two-way street. Second, we need to keep in mind that every change has all kinds of unpredictable effects on other aspects of your personality. Just as you said in the film, if you take away somebody's ability to feel pain during cancer treatment, it might also have implications for the military. But mostly, I think it's important for us to never forget that we don't have to constantly be changing ourselves. You know, we can work on changing our environments. Instead of altering the worker so that the worker can work in an unsafe area, we could think about making the area safe. Instead of getting rid of a particular kind of physical condition, we can get rid of the physical barriers in the world that make that condition problematic. Because I noticed that at least 3 of us are wearing eyeglasses, right? Which is a way of adapting to our environment. So there's got to be a balance in these discussions that we have to maintain.
You know, I will add to that, Alta. I think this technology is so profound and disruptive that you guys mentioned. You can change things in the health arena. You can change things in the ecosystem. So if you're doing a gene drive with the mosquito population to, you know, reduce malaria, that's going to change things throughout an ecosystem in a way that we might not really understand. It's so new and it's fascinating. I wanted to touch on one of the questions here, though, about this whole point about communication among scientists. And this is something I think it was Jim Kernan said here in the question. Those of us who are in science trying to communicate need to do so more simply. And I completely agree with that. This is something that as a researcher, I find that, to your point, Fyodor, if I went through clusterly, regularly, interspaced, short palindromic repeats every time, I lose people right there. And I think part of our whole goal with this is to use this massive disruptive technology as a way to engage and inspire the public about a conversation around genetics and health and environment. And I think that these are really, really important things that we need to do. I agree with that. How we do that, the tools for scientists to do that, I think we don't really get trained on that in graduate school per se. You get trained to sort of regurgitate the facts of the experiments that you're doing. But I think that's going to be really important for us. And I wish that there was some funding from the National Science or other foundations just for science communication. I'm throwing that out there for my federal people right now.
Well, I would definitely encourage that. And I think that it's really important to consider education as not as a separate endeavor from the research, that this must be, the scientific community must understand that not only do we have to do the research and make the breakthroughs, but we have a responsibility to bring the public into those discussions around it, and that the funding should, you know, our self-interest duly noted as communicators. But I think that the real revolution that can happen in science communication is going to happen from the scientific community, and that's what we really hoped. And that, you know, I think that that's the key role that, you know, one of many roles that Sarah played on this film, and all the participation of all of you, was that somehow that, you know, we fundraised for this film, and we produced it in a way that we were not buying into the sort of conventional wisdoms around science filmmaking, that this was going to be how we felt the scientific community wanted to set up this discussion and to go from there. I mean, one of the questions I did want to pick up what Laura Gonzalez asked, and this is a question of, can we use this, you know, to potential to increase biodiversity? And I think one of the questions about, you know, when people think of genome engineering, they sort of think a lot of monoculture and agriculture, and sort of that everything's becoming uniform. And can we flip it on its head? Does CRISPR actually allow us to actually have more diversity in terms of, and I think that's a framing that we don't normally talk about, but I think could be that touches on a lot of what we were also talked about already today.
I'm gonna do a 60-second rant, the start and end of which will be yes. Great example, the banana. The banana you eat that you buy at a supermarket is the Cavendish banana. Yeah, it's not the best banana. If you go to countries where they've grown varieties of bananas like Pakistan or India, and you go to a market, you see dozens of different varieties of bananas. Why aren't they more widely grown? Is because even though they are fantastic for the environment in which they live, they haven't been adapted like the Cavendish banana has through, you know, years and years and years of artificial selection to acquire some additional traits that make them agriculturally attractive. Where does CRISPR come in? It is feasible, and people have done this, to take CRISPR and add very precisely, like not make, a GMO that would be the object of riots on Telegraph Avenue here in Berkeley. In a very precise fashion, add just a single change to this beautiful, tasty, flavorful banana from somewhere in Pakistan. Make a change that would allow it to grow in a slightly different climate or be resistant to a particular pest. So in ag, it is absolutely the case that we can now, and in fact, there's been some beautiful work out of Cold Spring Harbor, Zach Littman and others, where they've taken wild varieties of tomatoes and made tiny, precise changes to domesticate them, all flavor intact, but preserve their sort of wild at heart nature. So specifically in ag, specifically for crops, staple food crops, that we have extraordinary opportunity to return biodiversity of our food chain by using precise targeted intervention to return a broader range of crops to our tables. Absolutely. Ask me how I really feel.
It can also be used to help salvage species that are endangered, so that it can help salvage the diversity we have, but we're on the verge of losing.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for answering a couple of questions from the audience. There was just one last one I thought was interesting. And Alicia Morales asks, I'll be watching the, sorry, that was the wrong one. Excuse me. We had somebody ask if it's possible to get access to the film to teach in bioethics classes. So I think the best thing for you to do would be to go to visit the Wonder Collaborative booth in the expo hall. And you can talk to Sarah, Elliot, or Meredith at the Wonder Collaborative, and they can help you to get access to the film so you can show it for your classes. So I did want to say thank you very much to the panel. I think you've all made an incredible film that will stand the test of time as a scientific documentary. And it's a fantastic piece of what I would call scientific capital to teach the world and the masses. And personally, I love being involved in it. And my favorite thing about the film is that it can speak not only to the general public, but also to scientists. It doesn't dumb it down too much, and it doesn't make it too over the head. So you guys hit a fantastic balance in the film. So thank you so much to Alta, Shaka, Fyodor, Elliot, and Sarah for taking part in the Human Nature panel discussion at World CRISPR Day.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, so as everyone says goodbye from the Human Nature Wonder Collaborative, I wanted to take a moment just to introduce Bob Deans, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at Synthego. And Bob is going to say just a couple of words about some of the talks we've seen today. So take it away, Bob.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been a tremendously motivating day, and what an eloquent panel. I mean, I really wonder why I volunteered to do closing remarks after such a showcase of knowledge and motivation. So certainly hearing about all the transformative applications of CRISPR technology today is just so impactful. And I really do want to give thanks and respect out to all the scientists and the translational leadership that spoke today. So I'm Bob Deans. As Kevin introduced, I'm CSO at Synthego. I've been here about 6 months, and it's been a tremendously challenging and motivating environment. My background is really from the therapeutic side, and I've been working both with adult and iPSC-based stem cell platforms prior to joining CRISPR, and I joined because I saw the strength and utility of genome engineering applied in our translational streams. You know, I'm also here because of the vision we heard Paul and Jennifer share early during the meeting, and because I know what we can do with CRISPR therapeutics. It's really about engineering biology and getting clear control, clear translational measurements and correlations of editing and response to treatment. Realizing we have accelerated regulatory paths now, we can move more directly with safe science to Haitian patient access. I certainly don't have to tell you to stay tuned for next year. We all know what we're going to be speaking about. I think the promise of the impact that CRISPR can have on our planet, from therapeutics to agriculture, infectious disease, ecology, you know, it's so broad and so impactful, and we all want and need to contribute so strongly. So I'll close with a reiteration from the earlier panel. I think something that's clear and dear to all of us. CRISPR is a culture of knowledge based on genetic diversity, and it's our responsibility to help our communities respect both. So Kevin, take it over. Let's close the talks and invite people over to network. Thank you all.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bob. So that brings to an end our speaking presentation sessions for the day. We'd love to say a really big thank you to all of our incredible speakers, panelists, and session chairs who joined us actually from 4 different continents today, and also our Nobel laureate keynote speaker, Jennifer Doudna. So especially though, we'd like to thank all of you for listening to the amazing research work presented by our speakers. Even if we had a technical glitch or two, we got through the day, but the day is not yet over. I highly encourage all of you to please go to the network lounges, which can make this seem more like a real conference. And they're open now, and you can continue the discussion, especially from the morning session. So they're divided into sessions that correlate to the discussion sessions we had this morning. And also especially please visit many of the excellent companies, resources like the Wonder Collaborative or the Crispr Journal, and the friendly faces in our expo hall. And by taking part there, you can actually get some cool free swag like you would at a real conference, and you still have a chance to win a bunch of amazing prizes from Apple. So we hope you've really enjoyed yourself at World CRISPR Day today so far. And our virtual take on a conference and bringing the genome engineering community together to talk all things CRISPR and to make some new connections and new collaborations. Thank you all for making World CRISPR Day a smashing success, and stay tuned to see what we'll do next year for World CRISPR Day 2. Hopefully we'll all be together in person by then. So take care, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of the day and the festivities.